A series of highly publicized police killings of unarmed black men in the United States over the last year has sparked a debate over police tactics and the criminal justice system and how they affect the lives of African Americans. And Canada isn't immune. Joining us now with his perspective on what he sees as a fraught relationship between black citizens and law enforcement is George Elliott Clarke, Toronto's poet laureate and professor of English at the University of Toronto. Hello.
Hello, Pia.
Let us begin with something that you wrote. It was in the National Post in the spring. This comes after the shooting of Walter Scott, an unarmed black man, by a police officer in South Carolina. So just a bit of what you wrote. Here it is. This South Carolina incident is news this week, but it is also old news in terms of black community and police tensions that exist in urban Canada as much as they do in the United States. And for the same reasons, frankly, that the default position of police generally is, quote, everyone's a suspect, but that in respect to black citizens, it becomes, quote, all are suspects all the time. Here you are, Toronto's poet laureate. You're an English prof. It's these stories were making headlines. What were you hoping to add to the conversation when you wrote this?
I wanted to break us out of the usual pattern of thinking of these incidents as being isolated, as being one-offs. There was a situation, altercation that happened, and unfortunately someone was shot, there was a misunderstanding. And this tends to be the way in which these cases tend to be presented time and time again. And I think it's important that we keep a historical perspective and realize that as opposed to being isolated, these incidents are in fact sporadic. It's not that they happen once and then don't happen again until some time further down the road, so to speak, but rather they happen frequently in different places all the time, but don't always make the news, et cetera, don't always spark protests of one sort or another. And I think that it's important to realize that the history of police versus visible minority relations in Canada and the United States is at least tied in part to the necessity that elites have felt over centuries to literally police persons of different color, especially black people, especially black men, black youth. And this has been going on in North America since the days of slavery. Okay,
we will get into the history and the evolution, if I can call it that, of this. But I want to stick with this article. White Cops, Black Corpses was the title. It's pretty provocative.
Yes.
I don't know if that was your title.
It was my title.
Okay.
I'm actually surprised the National Post kept it.
Okay. You receive any pushback to that title?
Oh yeah, there were a few people who wrote emails, and I had a couple of phone calls in relation to it. People who felt I was being unfair to law enforcement. And I should say, for the record, I trust and depend upon law enforcement like every other law-abiding citizen in our society, and I recognize their courage and their bravery in carrying out their duties, et cetera, and I applaud them very, very much so. All police officers, all peace officers, et cetera. But that doesn't change the fact that we do have a history of tension, which is not because black people are deluded or Native people are deluded, but because of the fact that there is a history of violent interactions where the parties that end up dead or assaulted or criminalized or convicted on false charges, et cetera, have often been innocent, have not done anything to bring about horrendous trains of events. You know, that's so I understand why people would be upset about you shouldn't be criticizing the police, but you know, this is a free society, and I think that those of us who have concerns about policing, about law enforcement in general, especially those of us who have been on the receiving end negatively of law enforcement for no good reason, I hasten to add, we have to be able to raise our voices and speak out about these concerns. I
don't want to get too tied up on the title, but the title is White Cops, Black Corpses. Why not cop culture and black corpses? I mean, you're putting this in a very racialized, in a very racial context, and we've seen examples in the United States where it is just not white cops who are accused of doing these things.
Absolutely, that's right. And as a matter of fact, we can talk about what happens to black persons sometimes who become involved in law enforcement, that they do become part of a culture which is oriented towards protecting the people they consider to be proper citizens, middle-class society, which is often racialized as being white or sometimes Asian for the most part, and those who don't fit into that category are racialized as other and criminal, black and native, particularly in Canada. or if we can get into ethnicities and we can talk about folks from different European ethnicities having been criminalized in the early 20th century, like Irish and Italians, for instance, in the United States, and Francophones in Canada were often criminalized, et cetera, for not speaking English. So there's been a history of these kinds of biases that we need to explore, and unfortunately, in the case of Black people and Native people in Canada, that is a history that's racialized, absolutely.
It's a history that we've heard personal stories about it this year in Canada. And probably the most notable is Desmond Cole, a journalist who wrote a piece in Toronto Life, talking about his experience as a Black man living in Toronto and his confrontations with police for being, quote unquote, not even quote unquote, for being innocent, for being stopped and questioned by police. And you said that, you know, this is personal. To what extent is this personal for you?
Well, it's personal for me in the sense that I think, like, and I really appreciated Desmond Cole's article because it made me realize I'm not crazy either. When I feel that I'm under surveillance, when I feel I can't walk down the street or I can't go into a shop without feeling that I'm being watched. Is
it a feeling or is it a reality?
Oh, it's a feeling, first of all, but it's often, too, a reality. And how can that make anybody feel comfortable?
Have you been stopped by police? Have you been carded yourself?
No, I have not been. And I appreciate the fact that I've not been. And if I ever am stopped and questioned, I will assert my constitutional rights to simply walk away, unless there's some real reason why I should be subjected to further questioning, et cetera, because every time this happens, it is a violation of our civil liberties. And this gets back to, I know we want to talk about slavery later, but I want to come back to that right now, because I really do think, Pia, that that's the nub of the question. As I said in my article, I don't think it's really that it's simply about being Black or being Native and so on. I think that there's a deeper rationale or philosophy behind this kind of misconduct on the part of law enforcement, not just in terms of police, but also in terms of judiciary, in terms of lawyers, prosecutors, et cetera. I think there's an underlying feeling in North American societies that Black people, first of all, should not be here. We should not be here. But if we are going to be here, we should not be free. We should not be permitted to walk the streets. We should not be permitted to drive our vehicles. We should not be permitted to live in certain neighborhoods because of the fact that we're Black, but also because of the fact that our economy, our society was built on slavery. True for colonial Canada as much as it was for the United States and colonial America. And this is also true for much of the New World. That relations between law enforcement and minorities, and even sometimes majorities in a country like Jamaica, for instance, as a result of the fact that underclasses were created as a result of economic exploitation, slavery.
Here's the thing, though. Most Canadians would say they don't feel that way.
Right.
That this is not some nefarious ploy on behalf of non-white Canadians to subjugate, to carry on the horrible legacies of slavery. So what do you say to that?
I say that it may not be a conscious effort. It may be subconscious, it may be subcultural, it may be a matter of law enforcement cultures that are, in fact, carrying on the procedures of slavery.
But they would say it is not deliberate. Like, for you to read into that it isn't, we don't have policies, we don't have processes, we don't have belief. So how do you sort of, you're saying what we see is what we get. Yeah,
well, but the statistics suggest that there is a rationale behind all this.
All right, look, I'm glad you brought up statistics. I want to build some context around all of this. And so this comes from The Guardian. They started, this has to do with the U.S. They started, the Guardian newspaper started totaling the number of people killed by the United States this year, 2015. So these are numbers up until June. So, and I'm going to compare them with Ontario in just a sec. So here's the numbers. Number of people killed by police in the U.S. this year. In 2015, 500 people killed by police in America. And among those 500 deaths, 49.6%, so almost half were white, 28.2% were Black, 14.8% were Hispanic and Latino. According to the 2013 census, the U.S. population, to compare it, is 62.6% white, 13%, just over 13% Black, and 17% Hispanic. I know that's a lot of numbers, but just that's the context that we need to understand this in. Here are the numbers. This is a study from a study on police use of force in Ontario. This is coming from the SIU, the Special Investigations Unit. This is from 2006, so different years, but here's where we are. The police shooting rate for Black Ontario residents is 7.5 times higher than the overall provincial rate. Furthermore, a comparison of the black police shooting rate with the white police shooting rate suggests that black residents of Ontario are 10.1 times more likely to become involved in a police shooting than their white counterparts. When you hear those stats, and again, I know that's a lot of numbers, but basically what they suggest is our rate here in Ontario is much higher than the U.S. Average. What do you make of that disparity? What accounts for that disparity? What are you seeing in Ontario?
Well, I think that it underlines exactly what I've just been saying, that subconsciously or consciously, there's a belief in place that they used to say in the United States, in a very racist way, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I think in some ways that attitude applies to black people, but that generally the only good black person is someone who is incarcerated or someone who is being watched all the time, someone who cannot be trusted to be a law-abiding citizen. I mean, I think that's really the nub of it.
Except for the numbers there, I mean, the distinction that I'm trying to get at is what's going on in Canada to see those kinds of numbers compared to the U.S., where most people say, look, we're not the United States. We don't have the same racism problems between white Canadians and visible minority Canadians and black Canadians. These numbers seem to suggest something quite different.
It suggests that we are over-policed and that the police have an overly suspicious attitude about black people. That's what it suggests. And it suggests, and in fact, if we go back to the Ipperwash shooting in Ontario back in 1995, and remember the inquiry into that incident and the trials that resulted from that incident, there was testimony that the OPP officers responsible or involved in that altercation, which resulted in the death of Dudley George, native protester at Ipperwash, had made racist comments that were partly anti-black and certainly anti-native. Jokingly.
Yes, they were caught on tape.
That's right, they were caught on tape. So there's proof that at least for those particular officers in the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, that they had been infected by some notion of racism where they were connecting Native people to black people in the U.S. Was suggesting as well they had the same kind of violent, suspicious attitudes towards these folks that some white officers have towards black Americans in the U.S., of course, right? So again, this comes back to an underlying belief system that black people cannot be trusted to be free citizens. I'll just put it that bluntly. We supposedly cannot be trusted to be free citizens. Therefore, if we're not trustworthy free citizens, how can we have a nice luxury car and have earned the right to have that vehicle? How can we live in a nice neighborhood in an expensive house? How is that possible? Because of course we're all supposed to be either illiterate, low-wage earning folks next to being slave labor, practically, or else all criminals or people with criminal records, et cetera, et cetera. And that this becomes, as I say, the default position in terms of police dealings with black Ontarians, black Canadians, black Nova Scotians, from Nova Scotia originally. And there have been many, many studies. I could think of the Marshall Inquiry, for instance, into the case of Donald Marshall, who was wrongfully imprisoned for a murder he did not commit and sat in prison for 11 years until a Globe and Mail reporter came along and did enough background work to convince the authorities they had the wrong person in prison. And he was in prison for the murder of a black youth, when in fact it was happened to have been, as it turns out, a white gentleman who had committed that particular crime. But I just point that out to underline the fact that we have this
someone else would point out that we have egregious examples of white people being wrongfully imprisoned as well in this country.
Absolutely, and I would say, as I end my article, I think that the ultimate answer to these kinds of questions, these kinds of concerns, is to have really strong civilian oversight of police. I think in a democratic society, this is a fundamental belief on my part that you have to have very strict, severe civilian control of police. In a democracy, you cannot afford to let the police ever even believe for 1 second that they can police themselves, that they are a force unto themselves, a law unto themselves. That is a huge mistake, I think, for a democracy.
Okay, I want to talk about the Canadian context. We started the program, listing the names of the a few of the numbers of unarmed black men in the United States who have been killed recently by police officers. Well publicized. I think if I said Michael Brown to most people, they would know who that is. If I said Eric Garner, they would know who that is. And yet the list of black men, and I actually have to look at the names, in Canada, that haven't gotten the same attention. Their cases. So Hugh Dawson, Michael Wade Lawson, a number of others. To what extent do you believe that Canadians don't know our own history as well as we know what's happening, more recent history, in the United States?
Oh, of course we don't know.
But what do we need to know about let me ask it this way. What do we need to know about the examples, the Canadian examples, to understand the country and the society in which we live?
I think we have to go back to John Porter's vertical mosaic for 1965 and understand that Canada is a society that has been constructed historically on a basis of race and ethnicity and religion and language. And that certain folks who fit the categories of having the right religion, the right language, the right skin color, the right ethnicity, were positioned at the top of this pyramid. And blacks and natives were positioned, to cut to the chase, at the very bottom of this pyramid. And I wonder if we compare the statistics that John Porter used in 1965 with the statistics that you've used today and others, how much that situation has changed. I doubt it has changed very much. I imagine that in terms of convictions, incarcerations, altercations with police, that blacks and First Nations peoples, Native Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, are still probably on the bottom of that pyramid in terms of economics, in terms of our earning power, in terms of our collective wealth, as well as in terms of our political power in the society, and that all Canadians have an interest, if we really truly want to have a multicultural and egalitarian society. And by egalitarian, I don't mean that everybody's the same. I mean true equality of opportunity, which I think is the real problem in terms of disparities of income, et cetera, we need to have real equality of opportunity across the board.
Okay, I want to just kind of hone in a conversation, just to focus a bit more on the unrest that we've seen in the United States over the last number of months as a reaction to citizens being killed by police officers. What are you reading into the comparisons between the two?
Well, I think that for African Americans, just in general, first of all, there's a long history of protest against perceived injustice, going back to the civil rights movement and way back to abolition, the abolition movement against slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So this is part and parcel of that history of protest that can involve politicians, pop culture figures, as well as aggrieved victims or relatives of victims, et cetera, or perceived victims, I should add very quickly. And because African Americans all share the same language for the most part, some are Hispanic, so there's a difference there, but for the most part share the same language and share the same cultural background and the same history going back hundreds of years, and are a constitutive part of the American society. From the president, we can say right now, all the way down to the poorest resident of the poorest inner city neighborhood. There is a togetherness of experience and protest that African Canadians do not have to the same extent. Although I hasten to add that when Buddy Evans was shot dead in the Flying Disco here in Toronto in 1978, there I was, an 18-year-old in Halifax, and I had phone calls. People were calling me saying, "Did you know Buddy Evans was shot yesterday in Toronto?"
So no, most people don't know who Buddy Evans was.
He was I guess I could say, the first contemporary victim, perceived victim of perceived law enforcement misconduct. I emphasize perceived all the way along here. That was in the summer of 1978, and certainly for Black Nova Scotians who were living here in Toronto, or those of us back in Nova Scotia, we looked upon that incident as being very suspect, as did many people in the Black communities, plural, in Toronto. And then the Toronto Black community actually began to become far more organized and galvanized into taking action in respect to law enforcement with the shooting of Albert Johnson in the summer of 1979. And there were many protests here in that city, against that police incident, or altercation. I hasten to use that word. And when Anthony Griffiths was shot in Montreal, unarmed Black teen by a police officer, there were protests in Montreal that were joined by Blacks from across Canada. But to get to answer your question or your observation much more quickly, it is more difficult in the world's second largest country with 2 official languages across 5.5 time zones, 10 provinces and 3 territories to try to organize national level protests against incidents of police violence in one city or another. Usually it becomes more of a local reaction with maybe a little bit of national attention or concern being expressed. And that's just the nature of who we are as peoples in Canada, and specifically in terms of African Canadians. We are not one monolithic group of people. We come from everywhere, from several continents, many different countries, lots of different ethnic backgrounds, have different religious beliefs. So the idea that we can all automatically organize together, even if we face common issues and common problems, is in fact a great difficulty to accept at face value. I wish that we could, and I do believe we should, and I believe that we will organize much more collectively and nationally, et cetera, that we have enough joint experience now, those of us over several generations now, going back to the first wave of major Caribbean immigration to Canada beginning in the mid-1950s. That's 50 years ago, 60 years ago now. So there's 3 generations of folks who have been in Canada who now can say that they have experienced the good and bad of Canadian life and are willing to organize more to oppose what we may perceive collectively as being the negatives of Canadian life.
Okay, I want to push back a bit. This is written by Heather McDonald. It's in the Wall Street Journal. It applies to the American context. I think it could be applied here as well. So here's what was written. This is back in May. Contrary to the claims of the Black Lives Matter movement, no government policy in the past quarter century has done more for urban reclamation than proactive policing. Data-driven enforcement, in conjunction with stricter penalties for criminals and broken windows policing, has saved thousands of Black lives, brought lawful commerce and jobs to once drug-infested neighborhoods, and allowed millions to go about their daily lives without fear.
Hip hip hooray! You know, that is certainly one side of the story, and I think that that's a great testament to good police work and good community relations. Absolutely good community relations, and I think that that's what I'm advocating today as well, is that we have better community relations. But that has to begin with an understanding of why it is that African Canadians, Native Canadians, other racialized Canadians may feel that the police force is not trustworthy, is not looking out for our best interests, is stopping and checking us without due cause, without good cause. And I think that we will achieve those better relations, better community relations, if we have honest conversations about what is expected. And also, if we have more social investment, more political investment in alienated and isolated communities. Communities isolated by class, alienated by class, as well as by racialization. And I give, as a quick example, the recent riot, I believe it was 2010, in North Montreal, which began as a result of the shooting of a racialized teen, Hispanic-related teen in Montreal. But the riot that resulted was multicultural, multiracial, because many residents in a low-income area of Montreal felt that they had been targeted for unequal treatment by law enforcement, as well as in terms of having lack of access to equal opportunity to find work, to find employment, to find investment, et cetera, et cetera. And so the result was a riot. I keep in mind that we also have hockey riots. I know this is Canada, and I'm not a sociologist, but I imagine that sometimes the hockey riots too are basically the expression of an underclass of one sort or another. And we could think of the Maurice Richard riots in Montreal, 1945, as an example of what I'm talking about here, with alienated French Canadians rioting over supposedly hockey game, but really because of deep-seated alienation. So to make a long story short, I think that we can start to solve or resolve some of these issues if we begin to have really honest conversations about what it means to be an outsider in a society that's about everybody supposedly being insiders.
Here's the thing. People want things to get better, I think. I think that we can agree on that. And you said, okay, we need more civilian oversight of law enforcement in this country. That's one fix. We've seen this province say we're going to change carding. What else needs to happen? And I really have about 30 seconds, so I'm asking you a big question in about 30 seconds. But what are the next few steps that we need to take? in this province?
I think that we need to have an attitude that says that civil rights, constitutional rights, are in fact more important than police rights. We need to begin there. We need to have that attitude, that the rights of citizens must always take precedence over anything else. Short of actual crimes being committed that have to be stopped, and so people can be protected, et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise, we run the risk of having the police believe that for our own good, they need to operate as if this is a police state. And we cannot afford to go down that road. We need to look at questions of militarization of police, for instance, et cetera, et cetera. But we also have to especially look at educating the public to realize the rights that we have and vis-a-vis law enforcement so that we exercise those rights. And finally, I have to say, and this is going to sound very Pollyannish, that we have to accept that everybody has a right to be here. You're a Canadian citizen, you have a right to be here, and you have to be treated equally. You have to be. And there should be real consequences for those who fail to follow suit.
I don't think you say anything that's Pollyannish. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate your perspective on all of this.
Thank you, Pia.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.